What happens when a man mistakes loyalty for weakness and discards the one woman who is holding everything together? Adriana Vale spent 6 years building an empire for a man who never once saw her as equal. One midnight, one suitcase, one cold dismissal, and everything changed. Not for him, for her. Stay with me until the very end, because this story doesn't end the way anyone expects. If this hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The gates were iron and old, the kind that had been commissioned by men who believed permanence could be purchased. They stood 14 feet high and were painted black every spring by a groundskeeper who never once looked Adriana in the eye. She had always assumed it was out of respect. Standing now on the outside of them, suitcase handle cold in her grip, rain hammering the gravel path behind her, she understood that it had never been respect at all. It had been shame. The guards stationed at the main entrance, 2 men she had known for 4 years, men she had fed at Christmas and whose children's names she remembered, stood with their backs slightly angled away from her, not fully turned. Not enough to be called deliberate, just enough to make clear they would not witness whatever was happening to her, whatever Lucian had decided was happening to her. The mansion blazed behind them, every window lit, gold against the black Illinois sky. The rain was coming in sideways now, off Lake Michigan, the kind that found every gap in your collar and didn't apologize for it. Adriana's coat was good cashmere. It had been a gift from herself, purchased with the first quarterly return she had ever negotiated independently. 3 years into a marriage, she had entered with more calculation than affection and considerably more affection than she'd intended. She did not ring the bell again. She had rung it once. She was not going to ring it twice. Her phone showed 12:47 in the morning. She had been standing outside for 11 minutes, and she had not cried, and she was not going to, and she shifted the suitcase from her right hand to her left and looked up at the second-floor window where the bedroom light was on, and where she could see, through the gap in the curtains, a gap she herself had requested when she'd had those curtains hung 18 months ago, because she liked morning light. The silhouette of a woman sitting at the vanity table, Vivian Cross, sitting at Adriana's vanity, in Adriana's bedroom, in the silk robe Adriana had bought from a boutique in Florence during a trip that Lucian had taken for business, and that she had turned quietly and without acknowledgement into 3 days of solitude that had been the closest thing to peace she could remember from the last several years. The silhouette lifted something, a brush, probably, and drew it slowly through her hair. Adriana turned away from the window. She had been inside that house 6 hours ago. She had been sitting in the study on the 3rd floor, reviewing a set of contracts that would mature in 11 days and required Lucian's signature and her countersignature, because she had structured them that way deliberately, because she had understood from the beginning that financial architecture was the only kind of power that couldn't be taken away in a single conversation. She had heard Vivian's voice downstairs. She had heard Lucian's voice. She had heard laughter that she recognized as performance. Vivian's laughter always had a shape to it, a calculated musicality. And she had set down her pen and sat very still for a while. Then Lucian had appeared in the doorway of the study. He was 51 years old and looked 43, which he was proud of. He wore a charcoal shirt open at the collar, and the expression he used in business meetings when he was about to offer someone less than they were worth, and expected them to be grateful. He had dark eyes that had once looked at her with something approaching admiration, and now looked at her with the specific blankness of a man who has already made a decision and is only present to deliver it. "You need to pack what's essential," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. "The house is going through some changes." He didn't come into the room. He stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame, which was something he did when he wanted to appear casual and which she had long ago identified as a tell for discomfort. "Vivian will be moving into the main residence." "I see. It's not personal, Adriana." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you think it is." He didn't flinch. She had expected him not to. Lucian Moretti had not built what he'd built by flinching. He had built it, or believed he had, through a combination of controlled brutality, political intelligence, and the loyalty of men who feared him. What he had never once acknowledged, not in 6 years of shared space and shared accounts and shared decisions, was that the infrastructure underlying all of it had been managed, maintained, and in several critical instances salvaged by the woman he was now asking to pack a bag. "There are hotels," he said. "I'll cover the cost for a month. That's fair." "That's what you think fair looks like." Adriana. "Don't." She stood up from the desk. She was wearing a gray wool sweater and dark trousers and flat shoes because she had not been expecting company and had not been performing anything for anyone. She picked up the contracts from the desk, her copies, the ones with her annotations, and placed them in the leather folder she carried everywhere. "I'll pack a bag. Give me an hour." He had given her 40 minutes. She knew because she had watched the clock on the nightstand, not her nightstand anymore, evidently, and at 40 minutes precisely, 2 of his men had appeared in the hallway outside the bedroom door. Not threatening, not speaking, just present in the way that made it clear the timeline was not a suggestion. She had taken one suitcase. She had taken her documents folder. She had taken the photograph of her father that she kept in the drawer of the nightstand because it was the only photograph she still had of him that hadn't been digitized, hadn't been stored on servers that Lucian controlled, hadn't been touched by any part of a life she was increasingly uncertain she had chosen. And she had walked out. Now she stood in the rain at 12:49 in the morning, and the car she had called, her own account, her own phone, nothing of his, showed 4 minutes away, and the iron gates were closed behind her, and the guards were not looking at her, and the bedroom window above was still lit. She set the suitcase down on the gravel at her feet. She put her hands in her coat pockets, and she breathed. The rain was very loud on the iron. It was loud on the gravel. It was loud on the long, dark driveway that led back to the gates from the road, the driveway lined with oak trees that she had suggested, and that a landscaper she had hired had planted 7 years ago when she and Lucian were still in the planning stages of the estate renovation, and she had still believed that building something beautiful together was a form of communication. She had been wrong about many things. She was trying to be precise, standing in the rain at 12:49, about which things those were and which things she had simply been prevented from completing. The car arrived at 12:53. A black sedan, clean, driven by a man who looked at her suitcase and then at her face and said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. She got in. She told him a hotel name. She looked out the window as they pulled away from the estate, and she did not look back at the gates, and she did not look back at the lit window, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what she was holding until the estate disappeared behind a curve in the road and the rain covered everything in a sound like static. Then she exhaled, just once, controlled, like pressure releasing from a valve that has been managed too long. She opened the leather folder in her lap and looked at the contracts. 11 days. She had 11 days before those contracts matured, and Lucian's signature would be required alongside a countersignature that, per the specific legal language she had drafted with an attorney whose loyalty she had cultivated for 3 years, and who had never once appeared at any Moretti function, would be invalid without hers. Lucian did not know that. He had not read those contracts carefully. He never read the contracts carefully. That was why she existed, had existed in that role, and it was the first and most foundational miscalculation he had made about her, that because she did the reading, she was the help. She closed the folder. She looked at the rain on the window. She thought about her father, who had been a financial strategist for men like Lucian, before men like Lucian had the language to call themselves what they were, and who had told her once, she was 14, she was sitting across from him at a kitchen table in a different city, in a different life, that the most dangerous position a person could occupy was invisible indispensability, being essential to someone who did not know you were essential. He had meant it as a warning. She had spent 6 years turning it into a strategy. The hotel was downtown, 40 floors, a place she had stayed during the renovation of the estate, and that she had never told Lucian she was particularly fond of, which meant he would not look for her there first. She checked in under her maiden name, Vale, not Moretti, and the woman at the desk did not blink, and Adriana took the key card and rode the elevator to the 28th floor and stood in the room for a moment with the lights off and the city spread out below her and the rain still coming down beyond the glass. She set her suitcase by the closet. She set her leather folder on the desk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands in the dark and let herself feel, for approximately 4 minutes, the complete and unedited version of what it felt like to be discarded. Not divorced, not discussed, not given a conversation or a consideration or even the decency of a mourning. Discarded, put outside, told the house was going through some changes, as though she were a piece of furniture whose style no longer matched the new aesthetic. 4 minutes. Then she turned on the desk lamp and opened her laptop and began to make a list. She had not slept by the time dawn broke gray and wet over the Chicago skyline. She had consumed 2 cups of coffee from the room service she had ordered at 3 in the morning, and she had filled 11 pages of a legal pad with names, numbers, dates, and the kind of annotated notes that only make sense to the person who wrote them, which was exactly the point. The first name on the list was Damian Reyes. Damian was 54 years old and had known her father before her father died. He had been present at her wedding, not because Lucian had invited him, but because she had included him in the 15 guests she had been permitted to add to a list of 230, and he had shaken her hand at the reception in a way that communicated clearly that he understood exactly what kind of transaction was taking place, and that he would not insult her by pretending otherwise. He had called her once, about 2 years into the marriage, to pass along information about a contract dispute involving a company that had peripheral connections to the Moretti organization. He had been oblique about the source. She had understood immediately that he was offering her something: intelligence, an opening, a demonstration that there were people paying attention to her situation who were not Lucian's people. She had thanked him professionally and stored the information in a folder she kept on a device that was not connected to any network Lucian's technology people managed. She had not called him since. She called him now, at 6:15 in the morning, and he picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been awake. "Adriana," he said. "I need a meeting," she said. "Today, if possible." A pause, short. "I heard something last night." "Then you know I'm not calling socially." "I didn't think you were." She heard him exhale through his nose, a sound she remembered from her father's study, from men who thought carefully before speaking. "There's a building I own on Wacker, 7th floor. I'll have someone leave a key at the concierge of your hotel." She stopped. "How do you know which hotel?" "Because you're your father's daughter," he said, "and your father always stayed at the Langdon when he was in the middle of something he didn't want witnessed." She said nothing for a moment. 10 o'clock, she said. "I'll be there at 9:30, he said. "I have good coffee." She showered. She changed into the one clean suit she had packed. Charcoal, well cut. The kind of suit that communicates competence without announcing it. She did her own hair and her own makeup, and she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment, and she catalogued, without sentiment, what she saw. 38 years old. Dark hair, dark eyes, a face that had been called striking rather than beautiful since she was about 25, which she had always taken as accurate. There were shadows under her eyes from the sleepless night, but nothing that the suit and the posture and the absolute stillness of her expression couldn't offset. She had learned, early in the marriage, that Lucian's world responded to the appearance of control as though it were control itself, and she had practiced the appearance until it became something closer to the real thing. She picked up her phone. There were 14 messages from Lucian's assistant, 2 from Lucian himself, both sent after midnight, which meant he had experienced some version of second thought and had then overridden it, which was a pattern she recognized. One from a woman named Clara, who managed the estate's household accounts, and who had texted only, "I don't know what happened. Please let me know you're all right." She replied to Clara, "I'm all right. Don't say anything at the house." She left the rest unread. The building on Walker was older than it looked from the street. The 7th floor accessed by an elevator that required a key fob. The space itself divided between a formal conference area and what was clearly a functioning working office. Real work, not staging. The kind of organized density that accumulates over years of actual use. Books with broken spines. Files in labeled stacks. A coffee machine that looked like it had been selected for function rather than appearance, and that produced, as promised, genuinely good coffee. Damian Reyes was shorter than she remembered. He had gray at both temples now and wore a dark suit with no tie and reading glasses that he pushed to the top of his head when she walked in. He shook her hand, no preamble. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what you need." She sat. She set her leather folder on the table. She looked at him steadily and said, "I need operating space, office infrastructure, legal support, and access to 3 specific financial institutions where I have existing relationships under my maiden name that I want to activate without any Moretti connection or visibility." He looked at her. "How long have you been building those relationships?" 4 years? He nodded slowly. "Under veil." "Under veil. Always under veil." He was quiet for a moment. He poured coffee into a second cup and pushed it toward her across the table. "Lucian doesn't know." "Lucian knows what I allowed him to know, which was enough to make him feel informed and not enough to make him understand the architecture." Damien picked up his own cup. He looked at her with an expression she was trying to read and eventually identified as something between respect and grief. "Your father used to say the same thing, almost those exact words." "I know. He said them to me first." A pause, then, "What do you need from me specifically?" "2 things. A lease on a workspace. I'll pay market rate. I don't want a favor. I want a business arrangement. And an introduction to one person, Marcus Venn." Damien set down his cup. "Venn," he said. "That's a significant ask." "I know what Marcus Venn controls," she said. "And I know that 3 of the business relationships I built over the last 4 years have peripheral connections to his network. What I need is a direct introduction rather than 6 months of indirect cultivation. Venn doesn't meet people unless he trusts the source, which is why I'm asking you to be the source." Damien looked at her for a long time. The city was bright and loud beyond the windows. She kept her hands still on the table. "Why not just take what you have on Lucian," Damien said carefully, "and put it in front of people who could end him tomorrow?" She picked up her coffee. "Because that's not what I'm building." "You're not after revenge." "I'm after something that lasts longer than revenge." She set the cup down. "Revenge is a transaction. What I want is a position. I want to build something that is mine, that is legitimate, and that Lucian's world eventually has to acknowledge on its own terms. I want to be standing in a room where he has to look at me and understand that I didn't need his permission to get there." Damien was quiet. Then he picked up his phone from the table. "I'll call Venn this afternoon," he said. "The space on the 9th floor has been empty for 8 months. It's yours effective Monday if you want it." He paused. "What are you going to call it?" She thought for a moment. "Veil Strategic Group," she said. He nodded. "Good name." She did not make the mistake of moving quickly in a way that could be seen. The first 2 weeks after leaving the estate, Adriana maintained the profile of a woman who was recovering quietly. She accepted no public engagements. She declined comment through a lawyer she had retained years earlier for purposes Lucian had never inquired about. She ate at restaurants that were nice but not notable, and paid cash and left no digital record of where she was during the hours between leaving the hotel and returning to it. She was, during those 2 weeks, doing the most intensive and consequential work of her professional life. The 3 financial institutions she had named to Damien held, collectively, account relationships she had cultivated using her maiden name, structured as independent consulting arrangements, funded through a mechanism she had built into the margins of the Moretti organization's legitimate business layer over 4 years of careful, incremental, undocumented adjustment. Not theft. She had been very precise about the line between what was adjustment and what was theft, both for ethical reasons and for practical ones. What she had done was closer to what an architect does when they design a building with a load-bearing element that only they fully understand. The building still stands, the structure is still sound, but the architect walks away carrying the knowledge that no one else has. The contracts she had taken from the estate desk were the clearest example. 11 days after she'd left, they matured. Lucian had his attorney attempt to process the countersignature requirement with a substitute name, a paralegal within his own legal team, per an internal directive that had apparently been issued without anyone pausing to read the specific language Adriana had drafted. The language did not allow substitution. It had been written that way deliberately. The attorney caught the problem 4 hours before the deadline, called Lucian, and Lucian had called Adriana's cell phone for the first time since the night at the gate. She let it go to voicemail. He called again. She let it go. He sent his attorney. The attorney called the number on file and reached her lawyer, not her, and her lawyer informed the attorney that Ms. Vale would require a formal written request through proper channels, and that her name was Vale, not Moretti, on the relevant documents, and that any communication should reflect that distinction. The contracts lapsed. They were not small contracts. Marcus Venn was 60 years old and looked older, a man who had accumulated the specific kind of weathering that comes not from sun or labor, but from decades of watching other people make mistakes he had anticipated. He had built a legitimate investment infrastructure across 7 cities, and he was connected to things that were not legitimate in ways that were structured to be unprovable. And he was, as far as Adriana could determine from the research she had done, the single most significant node in the financial network that surrounded and in several ways enabled the Moretti organization's legitimate business face. Lucian had met him twice, had never cultivated the relationship, had referred to Venn, in a conversation Adriana had been present for, as the kind of man who was useful but not worth the maintenance. She had sat very still during that conversation and noted the error precisely. She met Venn at his office on a Thursday morning in a high-rise that looked corporate from the outside and was, inside, the most deliberately casual environment she had entered in years. Comfortable furniture, natural light. He came out to meet her himself and shook her hand and walked her to a sitting area rather than a conference table. "Damien tells me you built the Moretti financial architecture," Venn said. He said it the way someone might state a weather report. Not impressed, not skeptical, just noting a fact. "Most of it," she said. "The legitimate layer, comprehensively. The other structures, selectively. And you've separated from that organization. Completely. Voluntarily?" She looked at him. "That depends on how you define voluntary." He almost smiled. "I define it as, did you leave because you chose to, or because you were put out?" "Well, I was asked to leave," she said. "I chose not to fight it in the moment. Those are different things." "They are," he agreed. He looked at her for a moment, not the way some men looked at her, trying to categorize her, but with the specific attention of someone doing a genuine assessment. "You have existing relationships with the Hartwell Group, Meridian Capital, and Northern Lattice." "Yes." "Under Vale." "Yes." "Any of those relationships compromised by the Moretti separation?" "No. Those relationships were never connected to the Moretti name. That was intentional." He picked up a glass of water from the table beside him. "What are you building, Ms. Vale?" She told him. Not everything. She was precise about what she offered and in what order. But the core of it. A strategic advisory group operating at the intersection of legitimate investment and the kind of high-stakes financial restructuring that came with complex organizational situations. The kind of clients whose books looked one way on paper and another way in practice. The kind of work that required someone who understood both landscapes without being compromised by either. Venn listened without interrupting, which was a form of intelligence she had learned to recognize. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're going to end up in the same rooms as Lucian Moretti," he said. "Eventually," she said. "Yes." "Is that a problem for you?" "Is it a problem for you?" she asked. He considered. "Moretti has been losing coherence for about 8 months," he said, "since last year's restructure. Several people I work with have noticed instability in his organization that I didn't see before." He paused. "That instability began approximately 8 months ago." She said nothing, which is approximately when you stopped being involved in certain aspects of the Moretti financial management, he said. She waited. "You didn't burn the house down when you left," he said. "You just stopped maintaining it." "Yes." "That's an interesting choice." "It was the correct choice," she said. "Burning it down would have been visible and attributed. What I did is only visible in retrospect once someone knows where to look." Venn set down the glass. "I'll introduce you to the Hartwell principals directly," he said, "and I'll make 3 calls this week that will open doors you'd otherwise spend 18 months trying to reach." "What do you want in return?" "Access to your thinking," he said. "Not exclusively, not contractually, just from time to time, when I'm looking at something complicated, I want to be able to call someone who's been inside the architecture of an organization like Moretti's and ask questions." She considered that. "You want a consultant." I want a peer, he said. That's different. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. Back at the hotel, she was still at the hotel. She had not yet moved into the ninth floor space on Walker. She was being deliberately patient about establishing presence before establishing infrastructure. She sat at the desk with her legal pad and her laptop, and she worked until 2 in the morning, and then she stopped, because she had learned at some point in the last decade that working past the point of diminishing returns was a form of avoidance masquerading as productivity. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark and she thought, not for the first time, about the night she had met Lucian Moretti. She had been 29. He had been 45. He had been at a private dinner hosted by a man she knew through her father's network, and he had been the most controlled presence in the room. Not the loudest, not the most demonstrative, but the kind of control that takes up space without requiring it. She had found that compelling. She had also, with the part of her that was her father's daughter, immediately begun cataloging what it would mean to be aligned with it. She had not married him naively. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, in the dark of the hotel room. She had entered the arrangement with open eyes and a specific set of calculations. The calculations had not included the possibility that she would spend 6 years doing work that was genuinely, substantively consequential, and at the end of it, be handed a hotel allowance and asked to clear out by midnight. Not because she'd failed to see that Lucian was capable of it, because she had underestimated, she thought, how much she had wanted to be wrong about him. That was the thing she had not put in any of her folders or legal pads. That was the part she was being careful about now, in the dark, not letting it become something she carried into the work. She had wanted him to be better than he was. She had built things with that wanting in her hands, and the things were real and solid and hers, but the wanting had been its own kind of miscalculation. She was done miscalculating. She closed her eyes. 3 weeks after she left the estate, the first of Lucian's business partners called her, not to offer condolences, not to ask about the marriage, to ask about a contract, specifically a trade finance arrangement that was structured around a set of collateral instruments that the partner, a man named Gregor, whom she had met twice at functions and who had always spoken to Lucian rather than her, could not locate in any of the documentation his own firm had been provided. She told Gregor politely that she was no longer involved in Moretti organization matters. He said he understood. He asked if she might, as a professional courtesy, indicate which attorney he should contact to locate the instruments. She gave him a name. The attorney was not Lucian's attorney. The attorney was a woman named Siobhan Mara, who operated out of a firm in Lincoln Park, and who had, 3 years ago, been quietly retained to handle certain documentation under the Veil name. Siobhan Mara had the collateral instruments. They were held in trust, per the specific terms of their structure, pending a review process that had been built into the original documents and that could only be initiated by Adriana Veil, not Adriana Moretti. Veil. When Gregor understood this, when he called back 40 minutes later with a voice that had shed its professional neutrality and was now carrying something closer to alarm, she listened carefully. "I'm not trying to create problems for anyone," she said. "The instruments exist. The process for accessing them is documented. I'm happy to initiate that process when I'm in a position to do so professionally. Which means when I have an operating entity through which to act formally." She kept her voice level. "I expect that will be in place within 2 weeks. I'll be in touch at that point." She ended the call. She looked out the window at the city. She picked up her pen and added Gregor's name to a list that was growing day by day, with the names of people who were beginning to understand that the woman Lucian had put outside his gate had not gone quietly at all. She had gone precisely, and the difference between those two things was about to become very clear. On the last day of that 3rd week, Lucian's name appeared on her phone screen. Not a call. A text message. 3 words. "We should talk." She stared at it for a moment. She thought about what it had cost him, that man with that pride in that world, to send 3 words that were as close to a request as he had probably come in 15 years. She thought about the estate behind the iron gates, the bedroom window lit against the rain, the guards who wouldn't look at her. She turned the phone face down on the desk. She kept working. There was a meeting with the Hartwell principals in 4 days that she needed to prepare for, and a lease agreement for the 9th floor space that she needed to review. and a call with Siobhan Mara about a structural question related to the Vale Strategic Group formation documents, and none of those things were going to wait for Lucien Moretti to decide he was ready to have a conversation. He had made his decision in the doorway of the study. She had made hers at the desk, in the rain, in the car, in the hotel room, in every meeting and every hour of work since. She was not waiting anymore. But 4 days later, when she walked into the Hartwell meeting and settled into a chair across the table from 3 men who had spent a combined 60 years moving serious money through serious structures, and introduced herself. Adriana Vale, Vale Strategic Group. One of the Hartwell principals paused before responding. He said, "I've heard that name recently, Vale. Someone in our network was asking about you." She kept her expression still. "What kind of questions?" she said. The principal looked at her with the particular attention of a man who is recalibrating something in real time. "The kind someone asks," he said slowly, "when they've realized they've made a mistake they can't easily fix." She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she opened her folder and placed the first proposal document on the table, and she said, "Let's talk about what I can do for you. We can talk about other things later." The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, she had the beginning of something. And in a mansion on the outskirts of the city, behind iron gates in the dark, a man was learning, slowly, expensively, in ways that would keep compounding, that the person he had handed a hotel allowance and asked to be gone by midnight had been, the entire time, the only reason the gates were still standing. The Hartwell meeting changed things, but not in ways anyone could see yet. That was the part Adriana understood better than most people who had ever sat across a table from her. Change in financial architecture didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with noise or visible damage. It accumulated in the gaps between documented decisions, in the spaces where the person who understood the structure had stopped filling in the margins, and it built quietly, the way water builds behind a dam that no one is checking anymore, until the pressure became something that couldn't be reasoned with. She signed the lease on the 9th floor space at the end of that week. On Monday morning, she arrived at 7:45 with a single box of materials, legal pads, the leather folder, her father's photograph, a coffee machine she had purchased cash at a store on Michigan Avenue, and she set them down in the empty office, and she stood in the middle of the room and looked at the city through the windows, and she allowed herself, for approximately 30 seconds, to feel the specific weight of what it meant to be starting from nothing at 38 years old in a city where her name had, for 6 years, meant something entirely different than what she was about to make it mean. 30 seconds. Then she plugged in the coffee machine and got to work. Chapped. Clara called on a Tuesday. Clara Reyes, no relation to Damien, had managed the Moretti estate's household accounts for 9 years, which meant she had been there 3 years before Adriana arrived, and had watched the marriage from the particular vantage point of someone who is present at every meal and invisible at every conversation. She was 52 years old and practical in the way that people become practical when they have spent decades in close proximity to wealth without possessing any of their own, and she had texted Adriana on the night of the expulsion and had received a 2-line reply and had not pushed further. Now she called. Adriana answered on the 3rd ring. "Clara." She moved the furniture. Clara's voice was flat and precise, the voice of a woman reporting a weather condition rather than expressing an opinion. "The bedroom. She had the bed moved to the south wall and she took down the curtains you ordered and put up different ones. White. She said they were more..." She used the word open. Adriana was standing at the window of the 9th floor office. She transferred the phone from her right hand to her left. "Okay." She's been in the study too. She asked Lucien about the filing system in the cabinet along the east wall. He told her to ask someone on the staff, so she asked me. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't have a key to that cabinet." A beat. "You do have a key to that cabinet." "Yes," Clara said. "I do." Adriana was quiet for a moment. "What does she actually want with it?" "I don't know, but she's been on her phone a lot. Different calls than I'd expect. She had a meeting at the house last week. A man I didn't recognize, not from the organization, came in a car that wasn't one of ours. They were in the east sitting room for 2 hours. Lucien wasn't home." Adriana turned away from the window. She sat down in the desk chair and pulled a legal pad toward her. Can you describe the man? Clara described him. Adriana wrote the description down without comment. When Clara finished, Adriana looked at what she'd written. Thank you, she said. Don't take any more risks. If she pushes you about the cabinet again, tell Lucian directly that she asked. Don't facilitate. I know how to handle myself. I know you do. I'm not doubting that. A pause. Clara said, He's not eating well. He's been short with the kitchen staff. 3 days last week he didn't come home until after midnight. Another pause. I'm not saying that to... I don't know why I'm saying it. Because you've been watching that house for 9 years, and you know the difference between how it runs when it's running right and how it runs when something's wrong. Clara exhaled. Yes. Something's wrong, Adriana said. That's not your fault, and it's not your problem to fix. Take care of yourself. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the legal pad in front of her. The man Clara had described, average height, 50s, dark overcoat, no organizational markings, arriving in a civilian vehicle for a 2-hour private meeting with Lucian's companion while Lucian was absent, matched in several specific details, a description she had in a file on her laptop that related to a name she had encountered twice in the course of the financial work she'd done for the Moretti organization. A name that was connected to a rival structure operating out of the Northeast. A structure that had, for several years, been looking for a productive entry point into the kind of business relationships the Moretti organization controlled. She opened her laptop. She did not reach a conclusion immediately. She was careful about conclusions. But she opened a new document and she began writing, in the precise annotated shorthand she used for threat analysis, what she knew, what she suspected, and what she needed to verify. So what? The call from Lucian came on a Thursday. Not a text this time. An actual call, his name on the screen, at 11 in the morning when she was in the middle of reviewing a proposal document for a client meeting scheduled for the following week. She looked at the phone for 2 full rings. She answered. Adriana. His voice was the same. That was the thing that struck her, immediately and with a physical quality she hadn't anticipated. His voice was exactly the same, measured and low. The voice that had once meant authority and safety to her in equal measure, and now meant something she hadn't fully named yet. I need to talk to you about the Hartwell situation. The Hartwell situation, she said. Gregor told me they've been in contact with you. Gregor tells you a lot of things. Adriana. A pause. She could hear him breathing. I'm not calling to fight. Then why are you calling? Because we have shared interests that are being affected by... We don't have shared interests, she said. We had shared interests. You made a decision about that 3 weeks ago. Silence. Then, I want to meet. No. Adriana. Lucian. She kept her voice even. She was standing now, which she hadn't realized until the moment she spoke his name. Standing at the window again, the city below her, her own reflection faint in the glass. You handed me a hotel allowance and had 2 men stand in my hallway at midnight. I'm not sitting across a table from you to discuss shared interests. I made a mistake. The words sat in the silence between them. She looked at her own reflection. You made a decision, she said. Calling it a mistake now doesn't change its nature. What do you want me to say? Nothing, she said. I want you to say nothing. I want you to stop calling Gregor's contacts to find out what I'm doing. I want you to have your attorney contact my attorney about any outstanding contractual matters. And I want you to understand that whatever you think is happening with Hartwell, you don't have enough information to understand it yet. Another silence. Longer. She could almost feel him on the other end of it, that specific tension she had learned over 6 years, the pressure that built in him when a situation was not aligning with his mental model of it. The contracts that lapsed, he said. The Gregor instruments. The Venn relationship. A pause. You built things I didn't know about. Yes. While we were married. Yes. Why? She looked at her reflection in the glass. Because your father's daughter married your father's enemy, she said, and she wanted to make sure she had somewhere to stand if the floor ever disappeared. A very long silence. Come to dinner, he said. Not here. Neutral ground. Just... No, she said. Not yet. Not yet, he repeated. Something shifted in his voice. Not softened, recalibrated. That means eventually. It means not yet, she said. Don't read more into it than that. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a full minute without moving. Her heart was doing something she didn't appreciate. A slight irregularity in its rhythm, a physical betrayal of the conversation she had just conducted with complete external control. She put her hand flat against the glass and felt the cold of it and breathed, slowly, until the rhythm settled. Then she went back to the proposal document. The client meeting was in 6 days, and the numbers needed to be clean. Vivian Cross had, by the 4th week, made 3 errors that Adriana knew about, and almost certainly more that she didn't. The first was the meeting with the man in the dark overcoat, which was not an error in itself, but became one the moment it happened in the estate without Lucian's knowledge. The second was her approach to Gregor. She had apparently called him directly, which Adriana learned from a source she was not going to identify, to inquire about the financial arrangements between Gregor's firm and the Moretti organization, representing herself in that call not as Lucian's companion, but as someone acting on his behalf. Gregor had not confirmed or denied anything, but he had, within 24 hours, placed a second call to Adriana's lawyer. The third error was the cabinet. 3 days after Clara's call, Adriana received a message from Siobhan Mara. Short, direct, the way Siobhan communicated everything. Someone pulled the deed records on 2 properties in the Vale Trust. Inquiry came through a title company, tracing the request. It took Siobhan 48 hours to trace it. The inquiry had originated from a paralegal at a law firm that had done small-scale work for Lucian's organization twice in the past 4 years. It was not one of the primary firms. It was the kind of engagement that left a light footprint, the kind someone might use if they didn't want the inquiry traced back to a significant name. Vivian Cross was not a stupid woman. That was something Adriana had known, or suspected from the beginning, and she had been careful not to mistake the performance of softness, which Vivian deployed with considerable skill, for the absence of intelligence. But there was a difference between intelligence and knowledge, and Vivian was operating in a landscape she didn't fully understand, pulling at threads without knowing what the threads were connected to. What she had found through the deed inquiry was the edge of something, the outer perimeter of the Vale Trust property holdings. She hadn't found the interior structure, because the interior structure was built in layers that would require someone with Adriana's specific knowledge to navigate. But she had found enough to confirm that there was something there. And she had, apparently, told Lucian. Adriana knew this because Lucian called again on a Friday morning, and this time his voice had a quality she recognized from the 2 or 3 occasions in 6 years when he had been genuinely surprised by something. Not angry, not calculating. Surprised, which in him had a specific texture, a tightness, a brevity, the voice of a man reconfiguring. "You have property," he said without preamble. "Good morning, Lucian." "In the Vale Trust, property I didn't know about. Property I own," she said, "in my name, prior to the marriage and subsequent to it, all properly documented." "You never told me." "You never asked." A pause that had a different quality than the previous silences. This one had something in it she could feel through the phone. Not heat exactly, but friction. "What else?" he said. "What else what? What else don't I know about?" She let the question sit for a moment. "Lucian, what you don't know about what I built is not a list I'm going to read to you over the phone. If you want a formal accounting of assets and arrangements relevant to any outstanding marital matters, your attorney can contact mine. That's the appropriate process." This isn't about the marriage." "Then I don't know what conversation you think we're having." "I think," he said slowly, and there was something in the slowness that she paid attention to, "that you built something inside my organization that I didn't authorize, and I think I need to understand what that is." "Nothing I built inside your organization was unauthorized," she said. "Everything I did had your knowledge and your signature, where signatures were required. The fact that you didn't read what you signed is a different issue." Silence. Then quietly, "Come to dinner." I said not yet. "When?" "When I'm ready," she said. "Which is not a timeline I'm going to give you." She ended the call. She sat at her desk and she was not, she told herself, shaken. She was reassessing. There was a difference. She had known that the property inquiry would surface eventually. She had built the trust structure to be opaque rather than invisible, because invisible structures collapsed under scrutiny in ways that opaque ones didn't. But the timeline was faster than she had modeled, which meant Vivian was more actively investigating than she had anticipated, which meant the situation inside the estate was more volatile than Clara's account had suggested. She called Damien. He answered on the first ring. "I was going to call you today anyway," he said. "Something's moving," she said. "More than something." She heard him moving, the sound of a door closing. "I had a conversation this morning with a man who runs logistics for a firm in the Northeast. Not directly connected to anything you'd recognize, but adjacent to a structure that has been trying to access Moretti distribution channels for about 18 months. She had gone very still. "The Northeast firm." "Yes." "There was a meeting at the estate," she said, "about 10 days ago. A man I couldn't identify through Clara's description. Dark overcoat, civilian vehicle, 2 hours." Damien was quiet for a moment. "That would be consistent with what I'm hearing, which is that someone has been offering an entry point into the Moretti organization. From inside." The office was very quiet. The city outside was doing its usual things: traffic, construction 2 blocks east, the ambient sound of a city in mid-morning, and none of it was audible in the specific quality of quiet that had descended inside Adriana's head. "Vivian," she said. "I can't confirm the name, but the profile of what I'm hearing, someone new to the organization, someone with access but without deep knowledge of the actual structure, someone motivated by..." He paused. "Someone who may have discovered that the financial architecture is more complicated than it appeared, and decided to monetize that discovery rather than report it." "She found the edge of the Veil Trust," Adriana said. "She's been looking at property records. Then she found enough to know there's something there she doesn't understand, and someone in the Northeast offered to help her understand it in exchange for access." "Access to what?" "To whatever she can pull from inside the estate," Damien said. "Documents, relationships, the names of people who do business with Moretti structures that aren't publicly visible." Adriana stood up from her desk. She walked to the window. She could see her own hands on the glass, the faint tremor that she did not permit in her voice or her face, but that showed up sometimes in her hands when something was moving faster than she'd planned. "She doesn't know enough to do serious damage," Adriana said. "She found the edge. She doesn't have the interior." "Not yet." "Not yet," Adriana agreed. "Which means the window is..." "Short," Damien said. "If she's already in contact with the Northeast firm, they have resources she doesn't. They'll start helping her go deeper." Adriana stood at the window and thought. "Does Lucien know?" she said. "I don't think so. Based on what you're telling me about his calls, he's suspicious about you. He's not looking at Vivian." Which was, she thought, almost perfectly consistent with Lucien's foundational blind spot. He looked hardest at the people he had categorized as threats, and almost never at the people he had categorized as loyal. He had looked hard at her in the early years. Then he had decided she was loyal and had stopped looking. He had never looked at Vivian as anything other than what she presented, which meant whatever Vivian was doing, she was doing it inside a blind spot that Lucien had constructed himself. "I need 48 hours, Adriana said. "To do what?" "To decide whether I tell him," she said. Damien was very quiet. Then, "You'd warn him." "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I need 48 hours. She spent those 48 hours working, which was her mechanism for thinking. The work occupied the surface layer of her attention and let the deeper processing run without interruption. She finalized the client proposal. She reviewed the Veil Strategic Group operating documents with Siobhan. She had a call with the Hartwell principals that lasted 90 minutes and produced 3 concrete next steps. And beneath all of it, she thought about Lucien. Not about the marriage, not about the rain and the iron gates and the suitcase and the illuminated window. She had put those things in a container that she accessed only when she chose to, which was rarely and briefly. She thought about him as a structural element, as a node in a network, as a man who had built something real, imperfectly, and with significant damage to people who had not chosen to absorb that damage, but real. And who was now inside a threat that he couldn't see and couldn't evaluate because the person he would have asked to evaluate it had been dismissed at midnight with a hotel allowance. She thought about what happened to the network if the node destabilized. She had told Damien she didn't want to burn the house down. She had meant it, not from sentiment, or not only from sentiment, from a precise understanding that the Moretti organization's collapse would not be contained. It was connected to legitimate business structures that employed real people, to financial relationships that would take years to disentangle without causing collateral damage that had nothing to do with Lucian's arrogance, and to the specific kind of institutional knowledge that, if it fell into the hands of a northeastern firm with different values and no existing relationships of accountability, would produce outcomes she could predict and did not want to see. She made her decision on the second night at 11:40, sitting at her desk in the ninth floor office with the city lit below her and a legal pad full of annotated considerations, and a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. She picked up her phone. She did not call Lucian. She called his head of security, a man named Brazelin, whom she had worked with for 3 years and who had always addressed her as Ms. Vale, even when the Moretti name would have been the easier choice. She called him directly, from her personal number, and when he answered with a wariness she could hear clearly, she said, "Breslin, I'm going to tell you something once. I need you to listen without interrupting, and then I need you to decide on your own judgment what to do with it." He said, "I'm listening." She told him what she knew. Not everything. She did not give him Damien's name or the source of the Northeast firm connection, but the operational substance. There had been a meeting at the estate, an unrecognized visitor, 2 hours, Lucian absent. There had been inquiries into property records connected to structures adjacent to Moretti interests. There was intelligence suggesting that the Northeastern firm had been in contact with someone inside the estate. She stopped. Breslin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're telling me this, not him." "I'm telling you," she said. "What you do with it is your judgment, not mine." "Why not go direct to him?" "Because," she said, "he would spend the first 20 minutes of any conversation I had with him asking about the Vale Trust and the Hartwell relationship and everything else he's been told to be suspicious of. And the information I just gave you would get buried under his suspicion of me, and the window would close." Another silence. Longer. She could hear Breslin breathing, slow and steady, the breath of a man who had been in dangerous situations often enough that his nervous system had learned to stay level when other things weren't. "You could have stayed quiet," he said. "If what you're describing is accurate, the damage would be to him, not you." "Yes," she said. "So why?" She looked at the cold coffee on her desk. She looked at the city. She thought about a very precise answer to that question and about whether it was the kind of answer you said out loud or kept. "Because I built half of what he's standing on," she said, "and I'd rather decide on my own terms what happens to it than watch someone else knock it down while he's looking the wrong direction." Breslin said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll handle it." "I know you will." She ended the call. She sat in the office for a while longer. The city did its nighttime things below her. She thought about the man in the dark overcoat, about the deed inquiry, about Vivian Cross sitting at a vanity table drawing a brush through her hair while the rain came down on the iron gates. She thought about what Breslin would find when he started pulling on the thread she had handed him, about what Lucian would see when those threads led somewhere he hadn't looked, about the specific expression on a man's face when he understood, for the first time, that the person he had dismissed was the person who had just decided his next 24 hours. She turned off the desk lamp. She put on her coat. She walked to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby and stepped out into the night air, which was cold and clean, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment before she called a car. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 11 words. "I know what you told Breslin. We need to talk. Tonight." She stared at the screen. The number was not Lucian's. It was not Damien's. It was not anyone in the organizational structure she had been mapping for the last 4 weeks. She looked up from the phone. The street was ordinary. Traffic, pedestrians, the ambient sound of a city at night. Nothing that should have felt different. Nothing that should have made the back of her neck go cold the way it was going cold right now. She had told Breslin an hour ago. Someone had known within the hour, which meant the information had moved faster than any internal channel should have allowed, which meant the penetration was deeper than she had modeled, which meant she had made an error, not in warning Breslin, but in assuming the Northeast firm's access was limited to Vivian's knowledge and the surface of what she'd found. They were already inside, and they now knew that Adriana Vale knew it. She did not respond to the text. That was the first decision made in the 4 seconds she stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand and the cold coming off the street and the specific kind of stillness that descends when a situation reveals itself to be larger than the frame you'd built for it. She did not respond. She did not call the number back. She took a screenshot of the message, time-stamped, and she got into the car she had called and she gave the driver the hotel address, and she sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap, and she thought. Someone had known within the hour. She ran the sequence. She had called Breslin at 11:40. The text had arrived at 12:51. 71 minutes. In 71 minutes, information she had passed to one person had traveled to someone who had her personal cell number, not her lawyer's number, not the Vale Strategic Group line, not the number that appeared on any documentation she had filed under that name, but the number she used for Clara and Damien and Siobhan and a small handful of people whose access to her she had chosen deliberately. That number was not public. It was not associated with the Vale name. It had been active for 14 months, obtained specifically for the post-Moretti phase of her life, and it had never appeared in any document or database connected to Lucian or his organization, which meant one of two things. Either the Northeast firm had resources she had significantly underestimated, technical resources, surveillance infrastructure, the kind of operational depth that didn't belong to the kind of organization she had profiled them as, or someone she had given that number to had given it to someone else. She sat with that for the duration of the drive. The city moved past the windows. The driver said nothing, which she was grateful for. At the hotel, she went directly to her room. She did not turn on the main lights. She sat at the desk with the lamp on, and she opened her laptop, and she pulled up every contact who had her personal number, and she went through them one by one, slowly, with the kind of attention she usually reserved for contract language. Clara, Damien, Siobhan, Breslin. She had called him from this number tonight, which meant he had it now, but he had not had it before tonight. Marcus Venn, who had exchanged numbers with her at the end of their first meeting. 2 Hartwell principals. A woman named Petra, who handled the building management for the Wacker space. Her accountant, who was 63 years old and had been her father's accountant before he was hers, and who she would have trusted with her life and was not going to begin doubting now. 9 people, 10 counting Breslin, who had had the number for 71 minutes. She went through them again. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the lamplight and breathed, and she told herself to stop trying to solve it through logic tonight, because logic required complete information, and she did not have complete information, and the attempt to reason from incomplete information toward a conclusion was how people made the specific category of error that then had to be managed on top of the original problem. She would find out what she needed to find out. But not tonight. Not at 1 in the morning with her hands still not entirely steady. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing, and she stared at the ceiling, and she eventually slept. Damien called at 6:15. She was already awake. She had been awake since 5, sitting at the desk with coffee and the legal pad, writing in the annotated shorthand that her father had taught her and that she had used ever since for the things she needed to think through without her own narrative getting in the way. "I need to see you," Damien said. No preamble. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not alarm exactly, but the controlled compression of a man who has learned something he did not want to learn. "When?" she said. "Now. The Wacker office. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Damien, what?" "Not on the phone," he said. "Please." She had never heard him use that word before. She put on her coat. He was already there when she arrived, which meant he had been closer than 20 minutes away when he called, which meant he had been moving toward her before he called her. She filed that. He was standing at the window, not sitting, and he turned when she came through the door, and his face had the specific expression of a man who has organized himself to deliver information he does not want to deliver and is holding the organization together through visible effort. She set her bag down. She did not take off her coat. Tell me, she said. Sit down. Damien, please sit down. She sat. He remained standing, which was a reversal of their usual dynamic in this room, and she watched him and waited. The Northeast firm, he said. I've been tracing the connection more thoroughly since last night. I called 3 people I trust before sunrise. He paused. He put his hands in his pockets, which was something she had learned he did when he was managing the urge to move. The firm isn't the source of the problem. The firm is the mechanism. The source is older than the firm. She looked at him. The penetration of the Moretti organization, the real penetration, not Vivian's amateur inquiry, goes back further than 18 months, he said. It goes back approximately 4 years. Someone inside the organizational structure has been feeding information to outside interests for 4 years. Someone with detailed access to the financial architecture. The office was very quiet. How detailed, she said. He looked at her directly. The kind of detail, he said, that only 2 or 3 people inside that organization would have had access to, at that level, in that time frame. She understood what he was not saying. She felt it land, the understanding, with a physical quality, a pressure in her chest, not pain, something more like the specific sensation of structural recognition, of a load-bearing assumption giving way. Who are the 3 people? She said. Her voice was level. She was paying close attention to keeping it level. In terms of that level of access in that time frame, he exhaled. The head of internal accounts, who died 2 years ago, Breslin, who has been internally audited twice with clean results, and... He stopped. And me, she said. He said nothing. They think it was me, she said. They're not thinking, Damien said quietly. They have documents. Adriana, I need you to hear this carefully. They have documents with your annotations, financial transfer records, communication logs, all dated within the last 4 years, all pointing to a systematic pipeline of information flowing from the Moretti organization's financial architecture to outside interests, specifically to a holding company that has since been traced to the Northeast firm. She stood up from the chair. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him and her eyes on the city and her hands at her sides. Those documents are fabricated, she said. I know that. The annotations would be easy to replicate for anyone who had access to my genuine working documents. The communication logs would require... She stopped. She pressed her palm against the glass. Cold. The communication logs would require access to document templates I used for internal correspondence. Templates that were stored on systems I used inside the estate. Systems that Vivian has been accessing, Damien said. Or someone working through Vivian. She turned around. They're not after the Moretti organization, she said. They were never primarily after the Moretti organization. They're after the Vail Trust, the financial architecture I built under my name. They needed a reason for that architecture to be invalidated, legally, reputationally. They needed a reason for the courts to treat it as proceeds of fraud. Damien sat down heavily in the chair across from where she had been sitting. He looked older than he had looked 3 weeks ago. If you're charged with financial espionage against the Moretti organization, he said, any assets held under the Vail name become subject to review. Investigation, freeze orders. Everything I built, she said, gone. Not destroyed, suspended. In litigation for years. Inaccessible. She turned back to the window. And Lucian would lose the financial architecture because it would be contaminated by association with a fraud investigation. And everything. The Hartwell relationships, the Venn connection, the Vail Trust. Everything becomes evidence in a case built on fabricated documents. She pressed both hands against the glass now. She could feel her own breathing, the controlled effort of it. Who built this? She said. Not the Northeast firm. The Northeast firm is logistics. Who architected this? Damien was quiet for a moment. I think you already know. She did. She had known, somewhere in the 3 seconds she'd stood on the sidewalk reading the text message, before she'd had the language for it. She had known with the part of her that her father had tried to develop in her, the part that read not what people showed you, but what the structure of their behavior implied. Vivian didn't find the deed records accidentally, she said. She was directed to look, specifically, by someone who knew the trust existed and knew enough about its structure to know what a partial discovery would look like to someone without the full picture. Someone who had seen your work, Damien said, up close. Someone who understood enough of the architecture to know where the edges were. She turned to face him. "How long have you known Vivian Cross?" she said. The quality of Damien's stillness changed. It was a very small change, a slight adjustment in how he was holding his shoulders, a fractional shift in his gaze, and she had known him long enough to read it, and reading it now produced a sensation she had no adequate word for, something between cold water and the moment before impact. "Damien," she said. "I don't know her," he said. "I want to be precise about that. I do not know her." "But—" He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the expression on his face was the expression of a man paying a debt he had been accumulating for a long time. "I knew of her before she entered Lucian's life. She was brought to my attention approximately 2 years ago by someone I do business with in the Northeast. They described her as— they used the phrase an asset being positioned." The room was very quiet. "You knew she was placed," Adriana said. "You knew she was inserted deliberately into Lucian's life." "I suspected. That's not a different thing." "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at her steadily. "Because when I found out, you were still inside the marriage. You were still inside the estate. If I had told you, you would have moved. You would have acted on it. And the people who placed her would have known that the placement had been burned, and they would have moved faster than you could. And the outcome—" He stopped. "I made a calculation." "You made a calculation," she said. "Yes. About my life. About your safety." His voice had the specific flatness of honesty that has stopped trying to soften itself. "I thought if you stayed still long enough, the situation would develop in a way that gave you more information and more options than acting early would have. You thought you knew better than I did what I needed to know to manage my own situation." He didn't look away. "Yes, I did think that. And I was wrong, and I'm telling you now because you need the complete picture, and I am not going to be the second person who withholds information from you because they think they're protecting you." She stood very still. She thought about her father, who had trusted this man. She thought about the morning she had called Damien from the hotel at 6:15 with the city gray outside, and the lease on this office still 3 days away, and her whole situation still in the process of becoming. She thought about the coffee he'd promised, good coffee. She thought about all the things she had told him, in this room and in phone calls since, about her plans and her contacts and her strategy. She said, "What did you tell them, the people in the Northeast?" His face changed, just slightly, but she saw it. "Damien." Her voice had dropped. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing actionable," he said. "I severed contact with those people 2 years ago, when I understood the scope of what they were building. But before I severed contact—" He stopped, started again. "Before I severed contact, there were conversations about the Moretti financial architecture in general, about the level of sophistication involved. I never named you. You described my work," she said, "without naming me, to people who were, at that point, already planning to use it." He said nothing. "They knew what to look for," she said. "They knew the sophistication level. They knew that the architecture was the work of someone specific, someone who had been doing it for years, someone who would have created parallel structures under a different name because that's what someone with that level of skill would do. They didn't need your name. They needed the fingerprint, and you gave them the fingerprint." The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that confirms rather than denies. Adriana picked up her bag from the floor beside the chair. She put it over her shoulder. She walked to the door. "Adriana." His voice was rough. She stopped. She did not turn around. "I am sorry," he said. "Those are insufficient words and I know it. I am telling you anyway." She stood at the door with her hand on the frame. She thought about her father's photograph in the drawer. She thought about the kitchen table in the other city, her father's voice, the specific quality of his attention when he was trying to give her something that would outlast the conversation. She thought about invisible indispensability. "You should have told me," she said. "That's the only thing I want to say to you right now. You should have told me and you didn't, and everything that follows from that is going to be managed without your input until I decide otherwise." She walked out. She did not go back to the hotel. She walked. Chicago in the morning was not interested in her situation. The city moved around her with its usual indifference. Commuters, delivery trucks, the smell of something frying from a place that was just opening, pigeons doing their grinding work on a ledge above a parking structure. She walked for 40 minutes without destination, which was something she almost never did, because she had always believed that purposeless movement was a form of avoidance. She did not currently care. She needed to think, and she needed her body moving, and she needed the space between herself and the office where Damien was still sitting with his debt and his insufficient words. By the time she stopped, outside a coffee shop on a street she'd walked to without planning, she had the outline of what she was facing. The fabricated documents existed. Someone had built them carefully, using her genuine work as a template, using access to her correspondence formats and annotation style that had been obtained from systems inside the estate. The documents pointed to a financial pipeline that didn't exist, money she had never moved, communications she had never sent, a 4-year pattern of behavior that had been constructed retroactively and placed, presumably, somewhere that made it discoverable, somewhere that the right inquiry would find it. The text message from last night, "I know what you told Breslin. We need to talk." Tonight had not been a threat. She understood that now, standing outside the coffee shop with the morning cold on her face. It had been an opening. Someone on the other side of that number had wanted her to know that they knew, and had wanted her to respond, and had framed it as an invitation rather than a warning because they wanted a conversation, not a confrontation, which meant they wanted something from her. Not just to destroy her. If destruction had been the sole objective, the conversation would have started with the documents appearing in front of someone who would act on them, not with a text inviting contact. They wanted the interior of the architecture, the parts Vivian's inquiry hadn't reached, the parts that Damien's descriptions of her work had suggested existed but hadn't specified. They had built the fabricated record as leverage, not as a weapon. They were going to offer her a choice. She understood this with a clarity that was almost calm, standing on the sidewalk, and the clarity was not reassuring. It was simply accurate. She pulled out her phone. She looked at the screenshot of the text message. She looked at the number. Then she looked at her call log. She looked at the call she had made to Breslin at 11:40 the night before. She scrolled back further. She looked at the calls from the past 4 weeks. She looked at Damien's number and the times of their calls, and she looked at what she had told him and when. She had told him about Venn 3 days before the Venn meeting. She had told him about the Hartwell situation the evening before the Hartwell meeting. She had told him about Breslin at 9:15 last night, 2 hours before she called Breslin, in a conversation where she had said she was considering warning him. She stood very still on the sidewalk. She had called Damien at 9:15 and told him she was considering calling Breslin. She had called Breslin at 11:40. The text had arrived at 12:51. Damien had told her this morning that he had severed contact with the Northeast people 2 years ago. He had also been waiting for her at the office before she arrived, moving toward her before he called. She thought about the specific way he had structured the revelation this morning, the careful sequencing of it, the way he had led her through the Northeast firm, through the penetration timeline, through the fabricated documents, and then to his own involvement, each piece arriving just ahead of the place where she would have arrived at it herself, controlling the pace, managing what she received and when. She thought about the text, "I know what you told Breslin," not "I know what Breslin was told." The specific verb choice, "you told," which assumed knowledge of her role that went beyond operational intelligence about Breslin's movements, knowledge of her specifically, her number, her call. She thought about Damien at 6:15 in the morning, already moving toward the Wacker building before he called her. She thought about good coffee. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a distant, almost clinical interest. The specific steadiness of her hands when she was in the middle of something that should have been making them shake. She had experienced this once before, 7 years ago, during a negotiation that had gone badly in a way that required immediate and precise improvisation, and she had identified afterward that the steadiness was not composure. It was the body's response to a situation it recognized as existential. Everything non-essential shutting down, all resources redirecting. She was not going to call the number from the text. She was not going to call Damien. She was going to call one person, and that person was going to be Siobhan Mara. Because Siobhan had been retained before Damien knew about any of this. and had been given the number before this phone had been in Damien's contact list, and had never met Damien and had no connection to any part of this situation that Adriana had not built herself, from the ground, before any of the events of the last 4 weeks. She called Siobhan. Siobhan answered on the second ring. "I need you to do something immediately," Adriana said. "I need you to initiate the protective filing we discussed for the Vale Trust assets. Full filing. Today." A brief pause. "That's the emergency protocol." "Yes." "Adriana, that level of filing is—" "I know what it is. I need it done today, not tomorrow. While the assets are still clean and the filing precedes any inquiry." Another pause, shorter. "I'll start in the next hour. Are you safe?" Adriana looked at the street around her. Ordinary morning. Nothing that looked like observation, though she was aware that her ability to identify surveillance had never been tested and she had no reliable baseline. "I don't know yet," she said. "Do you need me to call anyone?" "No, just the filing." She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk another moment. Then she walked to the coffee shop and she went inside and she sat at a table in the back corner where she could see both the door and the window, and she ordered coffee she didn't want, and she opened the legal pad she carried in her bag and she began to write. Not the annotated shorthand, something different, a sequence. An if-then structure, the kind she used when she needed to map a situation where multiple variables were unknown and the cost of error was not recoverable. At the top of the page she wrote 2 words. Trust nobody. Not as a conclusion she had reached, as a discipline she was imposing, as the rule that governed what came next, because what came next was going to require her to operate in a landscape where every relationship she had built since leaving the estate was potentially compromised, where the one man she had trusted most had withheld the most essential information, where fabricated evidence existed somewhere waiting to be deployed, and where the people who had built that evidence had her personal number and had used it to invite a conversation she had not yet decided how to respond to. She thought about the choice in front of her. She could stay quiet, protect the assets through Siobhan's filing, go dark, let the situation develop without engaging. The problem with that, they would eventually deploy the documents without her engagement because the leverage only worked if it had a target to press against. If she disappeared from the board, the documents became an end rather than a means, and she would be defending a fraud case with no context and no platform. She could go to Lucian, tell him everything: the Northeast firm, Vivian's placement, Damien's connection, the fabricated documents. The problem with that, she had no way of knowing what Lucian's response would be, and his response was the variable most likely to make the situation worse faster than she could manage it. Lucian cornered was Lucian at his most dangerous, and not specifically to the people who had cornered him. Or she could respond to the text. She looked at the 2 words at the top of the page. She turned to a fresh sheet. She wrote, "What do they actually want?" Not the assets. The assets were leverage, not the objective. The objective was something the assets could purchase: access, influence, a seat at a table. The Northeast firm was not a criminal enterprise at the level where raw asset acquisition was the goal. It was an organizational structure that moved through legitimate channels where possible and used other methods where necessary, and what it needed at this level was not money. It was credibility, architecture, the kind of layered financial legitimacy that took years to build from scratch, the kind she had built. They didn't want to destroy the Vale Trust. They wanted to own it. She set the pen down. She picked up the coffee. It was too hot to drink, and she drank it anyway and barely registered the burn. They had come at this from every angle simultaneously. Vivian inside the estate, the fabricated documents in reserve, Damien as a conduit whether willing or not, and now the direct contact through the text. They had built a situation in which her options appeared to be cooperation or exposure, and they had timed it to arrive precisely when her new structure was visible enough to be worth acquiring and not yet established enough to defend itself. It was, she thought, with the specific detachment of someone assessing an opponent rather than their own situation, a very well-built trap. She put the coffee down. She picked up the phone. She opened the screenshot of the text message and looked at the number for a long time. Then she typed a reply. 4 words. Name, a time and place. She pressed send before she could revise it, because revision would have been avoidance, and avoidance at this point was the one thing she absolutely could not afford. The reply came in 40 seconds. Tonight, 9 p.m., the Aldrich Building, 14th floor, come alone. She looked at the address. The Aldrich building was not in a neighborhood she knew well. She typed it into a map, looked at the location, looked at the surrounding streets. She had 6 hours. She needed 3 things: a record of this exchange sent to Siobhan with instructions, a way into that building that didn't depend on the elevator being the only exit, and 1 phone call to someone she could trust completely and who had no connection to any part of this situation. The first 2 she could handle herself. The third was the problem, because the person she would have called, the person she had been calling for 3 weeks, at 6 in the morning and late at night, the person who had given her the whacker space and the Ven introduction and good coffee and the specific quality of attention that felt, in her current situation, like the closest thing to a foundation she had, was the person she now had to treat as a variable rather than a constant. She closed the map. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them and looked at the coffee shop around her. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, the sound of the espresso machine, someone's laptop, someone's phone, someone's quiet conversation that had nothing to do with any of this. And she felt, cleanly and without drama, the specific loneliness of a position where the architecture you built to protect yourself has been turned into the instrument of your exposure. And the people you trusted to stand outside that architecture were inside it all along. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Tonight, everything changes. Either I walk out of that building with control of this situation, or I don't walk out with anything at all." She underlined it once. Then she started planning. She spent the first hour doing the things that could be done systematically. She sent the screenshot of the text exchange to Siobhan with a message that was 3 sentences long, the address, the time, and an instruction that if Siobhan did not receive a confirmation text from Adriana by 10:15 tonight, she was to forward a specific encrypted file, one Siobhan had been holding for 6 weeks without knowing its contents, to 4 recipients whose names and contact information were listed in a separate document Siobhan had also been holding. No other instructions. Siobhan did not ask questions. That was why Adriana had chosen her. The second hour she spent at the hotel, not the office. She changed clothes, darker, more practical, flat shoes she could move in, and she ate something she didn't taste standing at the window because she had learned years ago that the body's resource requirements didn't pause for high-stakes situations, and that the specific stupidity of going into something difficult while hypoglycemic was the kind of error that announced itself only in retrospect. She looked up the Aldrich building on 3 different databases. 14 floors, built in 1987, mixed commercial tenancy, currently about 60% occupied based on the permit filing she could access. The 14th floor had been leased to a holding company called Gray Line Consolidated for the past 16 months. Gray Line Consolidated did not have a web presence. Its registered agent was a law firm in Delaware. She looked at the building's floor plan on a city permit database that was publicly accessible and almost never accessed by anyone. Stairwells on both the north and south ends. The elevator bank in the center. The 14th floor had a single primary entry from the elevator and stairwell access from the south end only. The north stairwell terminated at 13 per a renovation filing from 2019. She memorized the layout. She memorized the south stairwell access point. She memorized the street-level exits. She did not bring anyone with her, not because she was confident she didn't need backup. She was not confident of that, but because the only people she might have called were now compromised variables, and walking into an unknown space with someone she couldn't fully trust was worse than walking in alone. She arrived at the Aldrich building at 8:47. The lobby was the kind of corporate anonymous that became invisible the moment you left it. Beige stone, a security desk with a guard who looked like he had been told to expect her, a bank of elevators with brushed steel doors. The guard checked her name against something on his screen without speaking and handed her a visitor badge and gestured toward the elevators. She took the stairs. The south stairwell was accessed through a door beside the restrooms, and she went through it and climbed 14 floors at a pace that was faster than casual and slower than urgent, and by the time she reached the 14th floor landing, her breathing had elevated and she paused at the door and let it settle. 20 seconds. She pressed her palm against the stairwell door and felt the cool of the metal and breathed through her nose and felt her heart rate come down to something she could work with. Then she opened the door. The 14th floor was not what she had expected, which was a data point in itself. She had expected something that announced significance, the kind of staging that people used when they wanted to communicate power. Instead, it was plain. A corridor, recessed lighting at half brightness. Doors on both sides, all closed. At the end of the corridor, one door with light coming under it. She walked toward it. Her footsteps were quiet on the industrial carpet. Her hands were at her sides. She thought about the south stairwell door behind her, its location relative to where she was walking, the number of steps back to it. She thought about exits the way she thought about financial contingencies. You built them before you needed them. You located them the moment you entered any space, and you never let yourself get so focused on the primary objective that you forgot they existed. She reached the door at the end of the corridor. She opened it. Bonnet. The room was large, corner-facing, with windows on two sides looking out over the city at night. It was furnished as a working space. Not an office exactly, more like the kind of room where decisions get made by people who don't want the decisions associated with any particular address. A long table, chairs, a credenza along one wall with water and glasses, no decoration, nothing on the walls. 3 people in the room. She had expected 1, possibly 2. 3 was a recalibration. The man at the center of the table she did not recognize from any database or description she had previously encountered, which told her he was either very good at maintaining a low profile, or this was his first direct appearance in a situation he had previously managed through intermediaries. 60, maybe older, with the kind of physical stillness that didn't come from calm, but from decades of practice at appearing calm. Dark suit, no tie, hands flat on the table in front of him. The woman to his left she recognized. Not from personal acquaintance, from a photograph in a filing she had reviewed 3 years ago. A regulatory matter, tangential to Moretti business, that she had researched extensively and then set aside. The woman's name was Elaine Marsh, and she was the registered director of 4 companies including, Adriana now understood, Gray Line Consolidated. The person to the man's right made Adriana stop walking. Vivian Cross looked different without the performance. That was the first thought, most clinical, arriving before anything more reactive could surface. Without the specific architecture of warmth and softness that she deployed in social situations, Vivian's face was something else. Attentive, watchful. The face of someone who had been working, not decorating. Ms.
Vale,
the man at the center said. Thank you for coming. She looked at him. You have me at a disadvantage. I don't have your name. Gareth Solt, he said. Sit down, please. She remained standing. I'll stand for now. I want to understand the shape of this before I get comfortable. Something moved in his expression. Not irritation, closer to assessment. He had expected something from her and was recalibrating what. She filed that. The shape of it, he said, is straightforward. You built something extraordinary inside a deteriorating organization. You've spent the last 4 weeks building something new independently. We want to be part of that. You want to own it, she said. We want a partnership. You built fabricated evidence of financial fraud and positioned it where it could be deployed against me. That's not a partnership proposal. That's a hostage situation. Vivian shifted in her chair, just slightly. Adriana did not look at her. Solt's expression did not change. The documentation exists as a precaution, a demonstration that we understand the landscape. The documentation is a fabrication. You know that, I know that. The question is whether you've placed it somewhere that makes defending against it expensive regardless of outcome. The documentation, Solt said carefully, is in a position where it can be released or not released depending on the direction of this conversation. Where? That's not... Where is it positioned, she said. Specifically, because if it's already in front of a regulator or a federal inbox, this conversation is different than if it's sitting on a server waiting for an instruction. And I will know if you lie to me about it, because I know the architecture it was built from better than the people who built it. A pause. Solt glanced at Elaine Marsh. Marsh gave nothing. It's been prepared for submission, Solt said. It hasn't been submitted. Prepared for submission to whom? That information becomes relevant only if this conversation goes in an unproductive direction. Adriana looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the table and she pulled out a chair. Not the one across from Solt, but the one at the end, the head position. And she sat down and she placed her hands flat on the table in a deliberate echo of his posture, and she looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you actually want," she said. He leaned forward slightly. The Veil Trust holds instruments and relationships that took years to develop. We want those relationships brought into a new structure, one with broader capital and wider reach than what you can build independently in the next 18 months. We're not asking you to hand it over. We're asking you to run it, with our capital behind it, under terms we negotiate tonight. And if I decline, then the documentation finds its destination, and you spend the next 3 years in litigation defending a fraud case built on evidence that, as you correctly note, you understand better than anyone. But that understanding is not the same as making it disappear. And litigation at that level consumes resources and reputation in ways that don't discriminate between guilt and innocence. She looked at him. She let the silence run for a moment. "You need me to run it," she said, "not someone else. Me, specifically. The relationships are built around you. The architecture reflects your specific methodology. Someone else running it produces a different return, which means the leverage works only if I stay functional and cooperative," she said. "A fraud case destroys me. It also destroys the thing you're trying to acquire." Solt said nothing. "You can't actually deploy the documents," she said, "not without destroying what you're trying to buy." Something shifted in the room. She felt it. A change in the specific quality of stillness from the 3 people across the table, a fractional adjustment that told her she had landed on something accurate. Then Vivian spoke for the first time. "He can deploy enough of it," Vivian said. Her voice was not what Adriana had heard through the estate walls. It had shed the performance entirely, flat and precise. "Not the full case. A targeted piece. Enough to freeze the Hartwell relationship and the Venn access while you're defending it. That's not destruction. That's leverage with a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer." Adriana looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room. Vivian looked back. She did not look away. "You were in my house," Adriana said. "My bedroom, my vanity table." "Yes." "How long were you building this?" "Longer than you were inside the estate," Vivian said. "I was in position before you left. The exit was accelerated by about 8 months when Lucien became manageable enough to make the timing work." "You pushed him," Adriana said. "The suggestion that I was holding him back." "I helped him reach a conclusion he was already moving toward," Vivian said. "Men like Lucien don't need much help reaching conclusions about women who outperform them." The room was very quiet. The city outside the windows was doing its midnight things, light and motion and the distant sound of traffic that reached the 14th floor as a hum, barely audible, like something breathing. Adriana looked at Vivian for another moment. Then she looked at Solt. "I want to see the documents," she said. "That's not... I want to see what you built, all of it, before I say anything else." She kept her voice level and her hands flat on the table. "I'm not negotiating in the dark. You want me to run something for you? Fine, that's a conversation we can have, but I'm not having it without knowing the exact shape of what you're holding over me. Show me the documents." Solt looked at Marsh. Something passed between them. Marsh opened the laptop in front of her and turned it to face Adriana across the table. She leaned forward and looked at the screen. It took her 4 minutes to read through what they had built. She read without expression, without comment, page by page through the fabricated correspondence and the falsified transfer records and the constructed timeline that placed her at the center of a 4-year intelligence pipeline. She read it with the same attention she would bring to a contract, looking for the load-bearing elements, the pieces that were specific enough to require specific refutation, the pieces that were general enough to create a fog even without proof. It was well built. She gave them that, internally, and without letting it show. The annotation style was accurate, close enough that someone who hadn't seen her actual work would find it indistinguishable, and even someone who had would need time and documentation to mount a specific challenge. The timeline had been constructed around real events that she had genuinely been involved in, with the fraudulent elements inserted at the margins in ways that contaminated the real ones. The correspondence was the weakest element. She saw it in the 3rd document, a communication dated 14 months ago that used a phrase she had never used, a construction that wasn't hers, One phrase in 40 pages, but it was there, and it was wrong, and it was the kind of wrong that only she would catch. She sat back. "You have a problem on page 31, she said. Marsh looked at her sharply. The correspondence dated November of last year, third paragraph. The phrase, pending receipt confirmation. I don't use that construction. I never have. I use upon confirmed receipt. Anyone who has spent significant time working with my actual documents would identify that as anomalous." She looked at Solt, which means the person who built your documents was working from examples rather than originals, close enough to be convincing at a surface level, not close enough to survive detailed scrutiny from anyone who actually knows my methodology. Solt's hands on the table had not moved, but his jaw had tightened by a fraction. "It's still enough to initiate," Marsh said. Her voice was carefully neutral. "To initiate, yes," Adriana said. "To sustain, you'd need more than what's here." She looked at the laptop. "What you have is a first move, not a closing one." "A first move is sufficient to cost you what I described," Solt said. "The Hartwell access, the Venn relationship, the time." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him steadily. "Which brings us back to the real question, which is what you actually need from me and what you're actually willing to offer. Because you've shown me your weapon and it's real, but it's not as clean as you implied, and I've shown you that I can read it, and now we're in a different conversation than the one you planned." Solt looked at her for a long moment. The city hummed behind the glass. "What do you want?" he said. It was the first time he had asked rather than stated. "I want the documents destroyed. All copies, all backups, complete deletion with verification through Siobhan Mara's office. I want the Gray Line entity dissolved or restructured to remove any connection to Moretti-adjacent interests. And I want to know who else has seen what's on that laptop." "That's a list of demands, not a negotiation." "I haven't finished," she said. "In exchange for those things, I will provide a formal assessment of the Moretti financial architecture. Not the Vail Trust, not my independent structures, but the Moretti organization specifically. Its vulnerabilities, its recoverable assets, and its relationship network. A comprehensive analysis that would take your people 2 years to reconstruct independently. You get what you actually want, which is an entry point into that landscape. And you get it without the liability of trying to own something that its architect will spend every remaining resource defending." Silence. Vivian was looking at her with an expression Adriana couldn't entirely categorize. Not hostility. Something closer to the specific attention of someone who has underestimated the weight of an object and is recalibrating. "The Moretti analysis," Solt said slowly. "You'd give us that freely." "Not freely," she said. "In exchange for what I described, and with one additional condition, which is, Lucian Moretti is not touched, is not his person, not his core operation, not his remaining relationships. The analysis is for your navigation, not your acquisition. You use it to position yourselves in the landscape, not to take his position in it." She paused. "He made mistakes, significant ones. He's paying for them through the natural consequences of his own decisions. That's sufficient." Solt looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You're protecting him." "I'm defining the terms of what I'll provide," she said. "Those are different things." Vivian made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like a breath with a shape to it. "After everything." Adriana looked at her. "After everything," she said. "I'm still the one who decides what gets burned and what doesn't. That's not sentiment. That's the same principle I've operated on from the beginning." She looked back at Solt. "Well." Solt looked at Marsh, a long look, the kind that carries a full conversation in the silence. Marsh's expression gave nothing definitive, but she gave a slight inclination of her head. Solt looked back at Adriana. "We'll need the analysis delivered within 30 days, he said. 45, she said. "It will be more comprehensive at 45. Another pause. 45 days. "And the documents," she said. "I want verification of deletion before I produce a single page." "You'll have it within 72 hours. She looked at him steadily. She thought about the south stairwell behind her. She thought about the specific phrase on page 31 of the fabricated documents, pending receipt confirmation, the one wrong note in an otherwise careful score, and about how she had found it in 4 minutes and what that meant about the distance between what they had built and what it would have needed to be to actually threaten her without destroying itself. She thought about Damien in the Whacker office with his insufficient words. She thought about Lucian on the phone, his voice exactly the same. She thought about her father at the kitchen table, the specific quality of his attention, what he had been trying to give her. She stood up. 72 hours, she said. Siobhan Mara's office receives the verification. When I confirm it with her, I'll be in touch about the format for the analysis delivery. She pushed the chair back under the table, precisely the way she did everything. She looked at Vivian one more time. Vivian looked back. There was something in her face that might have been, in a different situation, the beginning of respect. Or it might have been calculation. With Vivian, Adriana understood, those two things might not be distinguishable. You were wasted on him, Vivian said. I know, Adriana said. She walked to the door. She opened it. She walked down the corridor and she pushed through the south stairwell door and she descended 14 floors in the dark of the stairwell, with her hand on the rail and her footsteps on the concrete and her breathing controlled and even. And when she came out into the lobby, she walked through it without stopping and out into the cold night air. She stood on the sidewalk, the city around her, the ordinary midnight sounds, her own breath visible in the cold. Her hands were shaking now. She looked at them. A precise, detached observation, the shaking of her hands in the cold night air after 4 floors of controlled performance and 14 stories of stairwell. And she let them shake, because there was nobody watching, and because the shaking was honest, and because she had spent enough time managing the appearance of steadiness that she had earned the right to feel the actual cost of it. She pulled out her phone. She had 2 calls to make before the night was finished. The first was to Siobhan, to confirm she was out of the building and to update the contingency instructions. The second was one she had been carrying since the coffee shop this morning, since the legal pad and the 2 underlined words and the plan she had built in the 6 hours before walking into the Aldrich building. She made the Siobhan call first. 60 seconds. Done. Then she stood for a moment with the phone in her hand and the city breathing around her. She had told Solt she would provide the Moretti analysis. She had meant it, but the analysis she was going to provide was not simply a navigation document for an outside firm. It was also, built into its structure in ways she had already designed in her head during the meeting, a comprehensive record of every vulnerable point in the Moretti organization that had been created or exploited by the penetration operation that Solt's people had been running for 4 years. A record that would be as useful to Lucian as to Solt. More useful, because Lucian would know what it meant in context. She had not told Solt that. She had not told anyone that yet. She found the number she was looking for in her call log. She had not called it in 3 weeks. She stood on the Aldrich building sidewalk at 9:47 in the evening, and she pressed call and she held the phone to her ear. It rang once. Lucian answered. Adriana, he said. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has been waiting, who has been trying not to show that he has been waiting, and who is not entirely succeeding. I need a meeting, she said. Tomorrow, not the estate, neutral ground, your choice of location. A pause. Not long. Why? Because there are things happening inside your organization that you don't know about, she said, and I've spent the last 12 hours in the middle of them, and you need to understand what they are before they become something you can't manage. Another pause. Are you all right? He said. The question arrived with a directness she hadn't expected. She stood on the sidewalk and she looked at the street and she absorbed the question and she did not answer it immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. I'll be all right, she said. After tomorrow. There are some things that need to be said. I'll find a location, he said. I'll text you tonight. Lucien? Yes. She looked at the city. Don't bring anyone. This is between you and me. A long pause. Okay, he said. She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment. The shaking had stopped. Her hands were steady again, which was not composure, and she knew it. It was something colder and more functional, the steadiness of a person who has moved past the feeling and into the work. Tomorrow she was going to sit across a table from the man who had handed her a hotel allowance, and had 2 guards stand in her hallway at midnight, and had watched her leave through iron gates in the rain, and had not called her for 11 days. She was going to sit across that table and she was going to tell him the truth. Not all of it, not more than he needed, but enough. Enough to give him the chance to make a different choice than the ones he'd been making. What he did with that chance was going to determine the last moves of a situation she had been navigating for 7 weeks without a map, and she did not know, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, what those last moves were going to look like. But she was not afraid of not knowing. That was something she had learned in the last 7 weeks. The not knowing was not the danger. The danger was letting the not knowing make you still when stillness was the wrong choice. She called her car. She waited in the cold. And somewhere on the 14th floor of the Aldrich building, 3 people were having a conversation she was not part of, and they were deciding something, and whatever they decided was going to arrive on her doorstep in the next 72 hours as either a confirmation or a betrayal. And she had spent the evening in that room reading them as carefully as she had ever read any document, and her assessment was that they were going to confirm, because the alternative cost them more than cooperation did. But she had been wrong about people before. She had learned to hold the assessment and the doubt at the same time, to carry both without letting either one override her capacity to act. The car arrived. She got in. She looked out the window at the Aldrich building as they pulled away. 14 floors of unremarkable glass and steel, anonymous in the Chicago skyline, already disappearing behind the next block. And she thought about what happened tomorrow, and about what came after tomorrow, and about the specific quality of a person who has been reduced to nothing and has decided, deliberately and without drama, to build something that cannot be taken in a single midnight conversation. She thought about iron gates and rain and the particular silence of guards who won't look at you. She thought, not yet, but close. The car moved through the city. Tomorrow, everything either came together or it didn't, and she had done everything she could to make it come together, and that was going to have to be enough. And it was going to be enough. But the moment before finding out was still the hardest place to stand, and she was standing in it. And she was standing in it without flinching. Lucian chose a restaurant on the north side that she had never been to, which was deliberate. She understood that immediately. The choice of a place with no history between them, no association, no memory embedded in the tablecloths or the lighting or the view from the window. Neutral ground, as requested. He had texted the address at 11:15 the previous night, and she had read it and set the phone down and slept for 5 hours, which was more than she had slept in 3 days. She arrived 7 minutes early. He was already there, which meant he had arrived earlier than that, which was not something Lucian Moretti did as a rule. He arrived precisely on time or slightly after, because the calibration of arrival was a form of communication in his world, and arriving first communicated something he had always been careful not to communicate. She noted it without comment and sat down across from him and looked at him in the morning light coming through the window. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping either. Not dramatically. He was still Lucian, still composed in the surface way that was structural for him, still wearing a dark suit and the expression of someone who had decided in advance how much he was going to reveal. But there were things underneath the composition that she could read after 6 years of reading him across tables and through doorways and in the specific quality of his silences. He was tired. He was something else too, something she needed a moment to identify. He was, she realized, uncertain, not afraid. Lucian did not do afraid in any form she had ever witnessed, but uncertain. The specific condition of a man who has operated for decades from a position of sufficient information and is now operating without it, and knows it, and has not yet found a way to reestablish the ground under him. "You look tired," he said. "I had a long night," she said. "Do you want coffee?" "Please." He signaled the server without looking away from her, which was something he did when he was paying full attention, and didn't want to break it. She let the attention land and didn't deflect it and didn't return it with anything that would have made it easier for him. The coffee came. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Tell me what happened last night," he said. She told him. Not the way she had told Damien things. Not managed, not sequenced for effect. She told him the way she had decided to tell him in the car coming home from the Aldrich building, which was completely and in order, and without softening the parts that implicated her own errors alongside everyone else's. She told him about the Northeast firm and Greyline Consolidated and Gareth Solt. She told him about Vivian's placement, not as a woman discarded in favor of a rival, but as a precise operational account of what Vivian had been and when she had been put in position and what she had been doing inside the estate. She told him about the fabricated documents, their construction, and their specific weakness, what she had found on page 31, and what it meant. She told him about Damien, all of it, the withheld information, the early conversations with the Northeast people, the fingerprint he had given them before severing contact. She told him about Breslin's call and the text that had followed within the hour, and what that timing had told her. She told him about the meeting at the Aldrich building, what Solt had offered, and what she had countered with, and what she had agreed to produce. She told him that the analysis she was going to produce for Solt contained a second layer, a comprehensive map of every vulnerability in his organization that the penetration operation had created or exploited, built into the document structure in a way that would be legible to Lucian and his people and invisible to Soltz without the context to read it. When she finished, the coffee in front of her had gone cool. Lucian had not interrupted her once. He sat across the table with his hands around his own cup and his eyes on her face, and he did not move and did not speak for a long moment after she stopped. Then he said, "Vivian was placed." "Yes, before she came to me. Approximately 8 months before you became—" Her word was manageable, which I understand to mean 8 months before they assessed that you were sufficiently isolated from the people who would have recognized what she was. He looked at the table. A muscle in his jaw moved. "Isolated from you. That's one interpretation. Is it the wrong one?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not the wrong one." He sat with that. She watched him sit with it, not performing the sitting, actually doing it, actually taking in what it meant that the woman he had dismissed at midnight had been the person whose presence had been, among other things, the reason an operation aimed at his organization had needed 8 additional months to position itself. "Breslin," he said, "Breslin is clean. I want to be clear about that. Whatever the source of the leak last night, whether it was a tap on his phone or a communication intercept or something else, it wasn't him. He's been audited twice and both times clean, and my read on him, which I'll admit is limited, is that the source was technical rather than personal. I'll find the source. I know you will." She paused. "That's one of the things I want to talk about." He looked up. "The analysis I give Solt will take 45 days, she said. In those 45 days, if you move carefully and with the right people, you can close most of the vulnerabilities before they become relevant to whatever Solt does with the document. The analysis I give him is accurate, but it describes a landscape. It doesn't describe a fixed target. The landscape can change. You're giving me a window." "I'm giving you the information you need to use a window that already exists," she said. "That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. Why? The question was simple, and she had known it was coming, and she had thought about her answer in the car, and on the walk from the hotel, and in the 7 minutes she had sat alone at this table before he arrived. She had thought about the various true answers and which one was the right one to give, and she had arrived at the conclusion that with Lucian, the right answer was always the least comfortable one. "Because I built half of what you're standing on," she said, "and I made a decision a long time ago that I didn't want to be the kind of person who burns things just because they're no longer mine." She picked up the coffee, cool now. "That decision has cost me. I'm aware of that. I'm not rescinding it." Lucian set down his cup. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is understanding something he should have understood years ago and is experiencing the understanding as a form of loss. Not discovery. Loss. The gap between what he had known and what he should have known made visible all at once. "I thought you were quiet because you were content," he said. "I know. You were never quiet." "No," she said. "I was strategic." He exhaled through his nose. It was not a laugh. It was the sound of a man absorbing something he deserved to absorb. "I told Vivian she could stay at the estate until she made other arrangements," he said. "I told her last week before—" He stopped. "I'll handle it differently." "That's not my concern," Adriana said. "What happens at the estate is not my concern." "I know." He paused. "The papers, the divorce filing." My lawyer is ready to proceed whenever yours contacts her. I want you to have what's yours, he said. I mean that specifically and legally. Whatever a proper accounting shows you're owed from 6 years of... He stopped again. Started differently. You'll be compensated correctly. I'll make sure of it. I'll make sure of it, she said, through the proper process. That's not a criticism, it's just how I work now. Something moved in his face. Not offense. Fair, he said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment. The restaurant was filling slowly around them. Other people doing ordinary morning things, coffee and phones and the small negotiations of daily life that had nothing to do with iron gates or fabricated documents or 14-floor meetings in buildings with no web presence. Damien, Lucian said. He told me the truth this morning, she said. Late and badly and in the wrong order. But he told me. It's not nothing, she said. It's also not sufficient. I'm in the process of deciding what it is, and I'm not doing that on your timeline. She looked at him directly. I'd ask you to leave him alone. Whatever you want to do with that information is your decision, but I'm asking. Lucian looked at her. You're asking me to let it go. I'm asking you to let me handle it in the way I decide to handle it. A pause. He looked at the table. He was your father's friend. Yes? And your father would have... He stopped. Never mind what your father would have done. That's not mine to say. She looked at him, and there was something unexpected in this moment. Not warmth, nothing that simple, but something in the vicinity of recognition. The recognition of a person who had known her father and had understood, at least partially, what that man had been and what he had tried to give his daughter, and who was now sitting across from the evidence of how well it had taken. He would have said that trust is an asset class, she said. The most volatile one. High risk, non-recoverable on default, but the highest return of anything in the portfolio if you manage it right. She paused. He didn't always follow his own advice. Neither did I, Lucian said. The statement sat between them, simple and undefended, and she let it sit. They were at the table for 2 hours. The second hour was different from the first. More practical, less charged. The conversation of two people who have said the hardest things and are now working through the material aftermath. She outlined the timeline for the analysis. He outlined what he needed to begin the internal audit that would close the vulnerabilities. They discussed Breslin's role in that process. They discussed the legal framework for the divorce proceeding and the asset accounting in terms that were businesslike and specific, and occasionally, beneath the specificity, painful in ways that neither of them named. She told him about the Hartwell relationship and the Venn connection and the Vale Strategic Group's structure. Not to explain herself, she did not need to explain herself to him anymore, but because the landscape analysis she was going to produce for Solt needed to be accurate, and accuracy required him to understand which elements of the current landscape were Moretti and which were Vale, and where those two things had, in the last several weeks, begun to overlap in ways that required delineation. He listened. He asked precise questions. He did not ask them in the tone he had used in phone calls over the last weeks. The tone that carried underneath the professional phrasing the suggestion that he was the authority and she was being consulted. He asked them in a different tone, the tone of someone who is learning rather than verifying. She answered. She was thorough and she was direct and she was not gentle, but she was not unkind because unkindness would have been a performance, and she was done performing things for him. At the end of the second hour, he paid the check before she could, which was a small thing and might have been habit, and she let it go. They stood outside on the sidewalk. The morning had turned cold and bright, the kind of Chicago October day that looked like it should be warmer than it was. His car was at the curb. She had called hers while they were still inside. He looked at her. The estate, he said. I had the oak trees removed last year, the ones along the driveway. She looked at him. Why? Vivian said they made the approach too dark. He said it without expression. I should have asked you before I had them taken out. She understood what he was saying. It was not about trees. They were already planted, she said. They would have grown back eventually. That's... Yes. He paused. I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. I know you don't. I'm going to say it badly. I know that too. He looked at the street. He looked back at her. I spent 6 years watching you hold things together and telling myself it was because that was your role, because that was what you were there to do. He stopped. That was a convenient story. Yes, she said. I believed it because it was convenient. Yes. And I believed it, he said, and his voice had dropped to something lower, something that cost him more. Because if I didn't believe it, I had to believe that you were doing something extraordinary, and I was letting you do it without seeing it, without acknowledging it. And he stopped again. I was not equipped to do that. I know that's not sufficient. She looked at him for a moment. The morning light was doing things to his face that the estate lighting had never done, making him look for once like exactly what he was, rather than the version of it he maintained for the benefit of his world. You weren't equipped, she said. I know that. I knew it when I married you, and I chose it anyway. That's my error, not yours. She paused. You also became less equipped over time. That part is yours. He nodded, a small, precise movement. I'm not asking you to forgive it, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I want to say it because it needs to have been said. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the rain. She thought about the suitcase handle cold in her hand and the guards not looking at her and the lit window above. She thought about the hotel room and the legal pad and the 11 pages of names and numbers and the cold coffee and the decision she had made, quietly and without announcement, to become something that couldn't be handed a hotel allowance and asked to leave. She thought about everything she had built since that night and what it had cost and what it had returned. It needed to be said, she said. You said it. His car was waiting. He looked at it and then back at her. Will things be difficult? Professionally? After the Salt situation resolves. Things will be exactly as difficult as they need to be, she said, and then there'll be something else. He almost smiled. Not quite. You sound like your father. I know, she said. I'm working on that. He extended his hand. She looked at it. She shook it. Not warmly, not coldly. The handshake of two people who have been through something together and are choosing to mark its end with the simplest available gesture rather than with something that would require more than either of them had left. Take care of the organization, she said. Use the window. I will. And read the contracts before you sign them from now on. This time he did smile. Small, brief, the expression of a man who has earned the ability to find something slightly funny about his own damage. Yes. Her car arrived. She got in. She did not look back as they pulled away. Not because looking back would have been weak. She was past the framework in which she evaluated her behavior in terms of weakness and strength, but because there was nothing left in that direction that she needed to see. The verification from Siobhan came on the third day. Not the 72 hours Salt had promised, 71 hours and 40 minutes, which was close enough to a statement of intent that she noted it. Siobhan's confirmation was thorough, deletion verified across 4 identified servers, backup destruction documented, Greyline's restructuring filing in Delaware confirmed. Everything she had asked for. She sat with the confirmation for a while. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and she began to write the analysis. It took her 31 days. Not 45, but 31. Because she had been building the architecture of it in her head for years, and the act of writing it was closer to transcription than construction. She worked mornings and evenings and some afternoons, at the desk in the 9th floor office with the coffee machine and the legal pads and her father's photograph on the shelf she had installed along the east wall. The document was 114 pages. The visible layer was exactly what she had promised Salt, a comprehensive account of the Moretti financial architecture, its relationship network, its vulnerabilities, its recoverable assets, the map of a landscape that had taken years to build and that Salt's people would spend years learning to navigate. It was accurate. It was professionally thorough. It was the work of someone who understood the landscape from the inside and had decided to render it honestly. The second layer was invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. Built into the structure of the analysis, in the specific sequencing of vulnerability disclosures and the particular language she used for certain relationship descriptions, was a complete encoded account of every penetration point that the Northeast operation had created or exploited. Entry vectors, compromised communication channels, the specific personnel whose access had been used without their knowledge. Readable, with the right key, by Lucien's internal security team. She had given Breslin the key 3 days before she delivered the document to Solt. She had not told Solt. She had not told Lucien that she had not told Solt. She had told no one. It was not deception, exactly. It was the kind of architecture she had always built. Structures that served multiple purposes simultaneously, that looked from the outside like one thing and functioned from the inside as something more. It was how her father had taught her to think, and it was how she had always worked, and she was not going to apologize for it or explain it to anyone who hadn't asked. She delivered the document to Solt's office through a courier on a Tuesday morning. She received a confirmation at 4 that afternoon. She did not hear from Gareth Solt again, which was what she had expected and what she had wanted. Damien called in the 5th week. She let it ring the first time. She answered the second. "I want to say something," he said, "and then I won't call again unless you call first." She didn't tell him to proceed. She waited. "Your father asked me once to look out for you," he said, "not long before he died. We were at dinner, just the two of us, and he didn't say it like a request. He said it the way he said things that were already decided. Look out for Adriana. She's going to need someone who isn't impressed by her." A pause. "I told him I would. And then I made decisions that I told myself were protective and that they were about my own comfort, my own assessment of what was manageable. I protected myself and called it protecting you." She was at the window. The city was doing its late afternoon things. "He was right that I'd need someone who wasn't impressed by me," she said. "He was wrong that you were that person." A long pause. "Yes," Damien said. "He was." "I know you loved him," she said, "and I know the decision you made came from something that started as genuine. Those things are both true, and they don't change what happened." "No," he said, "they don't." "I'm not going to tell you we're finished," she said. "I'm going to tell you that it will be a long time before I know what we are, and you're going to have to be comfortable with that being the entire answer for now." "I understand," he said. "Okay. Adriana." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Age, maybe. The specific weight of a man accounting for something that can't be returned to. For what it's worth, everything he thought you'd become, you became it. He would have been proud isn't sufficient. He would have been... He stopped. "I know," she said quietly. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a long time. The divorce was finalized in the 3rd month. It was not dramatic. The papers were filed, the accounting was completed, the assets were allocated. Her lawyer and his lawyer exchanged the documents that needed to be exchanged, and the process moved through its legal stages with the efficient indifference of institutional machinery, which was exactly how she had wanted it to move. The final signature was required in person, which meant she and Lucien sat across a conference table at a law firm in the Loop on a gray November afternoon with their respective attorneys present and signed their names in the places indicated and initialed the pages that required initials. He had aged in the 3 months since the restaurant. Not dramatically. He was still Lucien, still composed, still occupying space with the specific density of a man who has spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. But there was something different in it now. A quality she recognized from the 1 or 2 other times in the 6 years of their marriage, when he had been required to account for himself in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was a man rebuilding, and he knew how to do it. But the rebuilding was costing him in ways that didn't show on the outside. When everything was signed, the attorneys gathered their materials and excused themselves with the professional tact of people who understand that the people in front of them need a moment they cannot provide. The conference room was quiet. She capped her pen. She aligned the papers in front of her. She looked up. He was looking at her. "I thought making you powerless would make me stronger," he said. Not loudly. The sentence of a man who has rehearsed something and is saying it because it deserved to be said regardless of whether the moment was right. She looked at him. "You were never stronger," she said. "You were just standing on top of everything I built." He nodded. Not a contradiction. An acceptance. She picked up her folder. She stood. "Take care of yourself, Lucian." "You too," he said, and then quietly, "I mean that." "I know you do." She walked out of the conference room. She walked through the law firm lobby, through the glass doors, out into the November air. It was cold and gray, and the lake wind was doing what it did in November, which was everything at once. She stood on the sidewalk and she breathed it in, the cold, the noise, the indifferent November city. And she felt cleanly and without performance the specific weight of something that was finished. Not loss, not exactly, something more complex than loss. The compound feeling of a chapter that had contained real things, real effort, real moments that had mattered, closed permanently and irrevocably, and the specific solitude of standing in the first moment of what came after. She had been expecting it to feel like relief. It felt like standing on new ground for the first time. The ground was solid. She had built it. She knew its weight and its limits. But it was new, and new ground always had the slight instability of the unfamiliar. And she was going to have to learn it the way she had learned everything else. By working, by paying attention, by refusing to let the unfamiliar become a reason to stand still. She called her car. Vale's strategic group occupied the full 9th floor by December. Not just the office she had started in, the entire floor, 6 months after she had moved in with a box of legal pads and a coffee machine. 3 full-time staff, 2 contractors, a client list that had grown from the Hartwell principals and Marcus Venn to 11 active engagements across financial advisory, organizational restructuring, and the specific category of strategic analysis that only someone with her particular background could provide. She was in every morning before 8 and most evenings until 7 or later, which was a schedule she maintained not from compulsion, but from the specific satisfaction of work that was entirely, unambiguously hers. Every relationship she had built, she had built. Every decision she made, she made. The credit belonged to no one who hadn't earned it, and the accountability rested nowhere it didn't belong. Her name on the door said Vale, not Moretti, not the hyphenated compromise she had briefly considered in the early days of the marriage, when she still believed that names could be shared without the sharing becoming a form of subsumption. Vale, the way it had been before, and the way it was going to be. She had moved out of the hotel in the 2nd month and into an apartment on the 42nd floor of a building that looked northwest, so that on clear days she could see the lake, and on very clear days something beyond it. It was smaller than the estate, considerably smaller, with the kind of deliberate sparseness that comes not from minimalism as an aesthetic, but from the decision to acquire only what you had chosen, rather than what had accumulated around a life you were inhabiting rather than building. Her father's photograph was on the desk. She had bought herself one good piece of furniture, an armchair, dark green, near the window that faced the lake. And she sat in it some evenings when the work was done and the city went dark, and she allowed herself the specific luxury of existing without a task in front of her, without a call to make or a document to review, without the need to be anything other than the person sitting in the chair. She thought, in those evenings, about the things the last 7 months had cost her. She was honest about the cost because she was her father's daughter, and her father had believed that dishonesty about cost was the most expensive form of dishonesty. That what you didn't account for always surfaced later, with interest. She had lost 6 years of work that would never be credited to her in any visible way. She had lost the version of a life she had tried to build inside a structure that wasn't designed for her to build in, and the loss of that version had required her to grieve it even while she was already building something else. And the grieving and the building had happened simultaneously, and that simultaneity had been exhausting in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was over. She had lost clarity about Damien, which was a particular kind of loss because it was a loss of something she hadn't known she was depending on until it was gone. She had not lost herself. She wanted to be precise about that, not as comfort, but as accurate accounting. The person who had packed a suitcase and stood in the rain outside iron gates had been frightened and angry and carrying 7 years of unacknowledged labor, but she had been intact. The frightened and angry and overburdened person had known, even at 12:49 in the rain, what she was going to do next. Not in specific terms. She had not planned the 9th floor or Vale's strategic group or the Aldrich building or the SALT negotiation. But in the most fundamental sense, she had known she was going to move forward. She had never, not once, considered going back. That was the thing she had thought about most in the evenings in the green armchair. Not the things that had been done to her, or the systems that had enabled them, or the specific individuals who had made choices she couldn't control. Those things were real, and they had mattered, and she had addressed them, most of them, in the ways available to her. But what she thought about was the knowing, the specific quality of knowledge she had carried in her hands in the rain, in the hotel room, in the coffee shop on the sidewalk, that she was going to be all right, not because someone was going to fix it, or because the situation was going to improve, or because she had a plan, but because she had herself, her father's daughter, the woman with the legal pad and the annotated shorthand and the cold coffee and the ability to read a document in 4 minutes and find the wrong phrase. She thought about Vivian Cross, who had been positioned inside a marriage as a piece of someone else's strategy and who had, in the end, been discarded by that strategy the moment Solt's need for Adriana's cooperation superseded his need for Vivian's access. She had heard, through channels she didn't ask about too specifically, that Vivian had left Chicago. She did not know where she had gone. She found that she did not wish Vivian harm, which surprised her a little, and then did not. Vivian had been a mechanism. The mechanism had been effective. The mechanism had also, in building the pressure that forced the situation into its final form, done something it had not intended. It had given Adriana the confrontation she had needed to have. With Solt, with Damien, with Lucien, with the entire architecture of a life she had built partially for someone else and partially for herself, and that she now had, finally, entirely to herself. There was a cost to that. She had been clear-eyed about the cost, but there was also, and she was going to permit herself to name it, alone in the green armchair with the city below, something that felt imprecisely but genuinely like the correct placement of weight, the sensation of a thing sitting where it was supposed to sit. Not happiness, necessarily. Not yet. But the precondition for it, the specific stability of ground that you built, and therefore know, that you stand on and therefore own, that no one can hand you a hotel allowance and take away. She had been something before him. She was something after him. The difference was that she knew it now in a way she hadn't known it then. Not as a claim she could make, not as a resume of accomplishments, but as a fact of her own experience, earned through the specific curriculum of the last 7 months, tested and verified and paid for in the currency of everything she'd had to give. She sat in the chair. She looked at the lake. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in December. Cold, blunt, indifferent to individual stories, churning through its massive ordinary life with the total commitment of a city that didn't need your particular drama to keep moving. She had always found that quality of cities more comforting than people generally seem to. The city did not require anything of her tonight. The work was done. The calls were made. The documents were filed. The analysis was delivered. The papers were signed. The threads were closed. She had built something that was hers. The estate behind the iron gates had been sold in November. She had seen the listing briefly by accident while looking for something else online. 6 bedrooms, 4 reception rooms, extensive grounds, the oak trees replaced by an explanation that the property featured recent landscaping updates. The bedroom where Vivian had sat at the vanity table was described in the listing as a principal suite with excellent natural light. The asking price was significant. Adriana had closed the browser and gone back to the document she'd been working on. She was not the woman who had stood outside those gates in the rain. She was also not someone entirely different from her. The through line was unbroken. The person was continuous. The woman with the suitcase and the woman in the armchair were the same woman in the only way that mattered. But she had shed something. Not the damage. You didn't shed damage. It became part of the structure. It changed the load-bearing calculation in ways that required ongoing accounting. But the part that had been waiting, the part that had been, despite everything she'd built and planned and protected, still partly oriented towards someone else's recognition. She wasn't waiting anymore. That was the thing she would not have been able to articulate clearly from outside the iron gates at 12:49 in the rain, because it was the kind of knowledge that required the full experience of its own acquisition. You could not know that you were done waiting until you had arrived at the place where there was nothing left to wait for. And the place where there was nothing left to wait for turned out to be exactly where you needed to be all along. She sat in the green armchair until the city was fully dark. Then she got up and went to the desk and turned on the lamp and began tomorrow's work.